This video addresses in simpler terms some useful facts about ATP and why is this molecule so important. First, let's write down a very common reaction that we see all the time when we study metabolism. ATP becomes ADP, or adenosine triphosphate becomes adenosine diphosphate. But what does that mean? Adenosine triphosphate donates a phosphate group and becomes adenosine diphosphate. But that is still a little confusing and doesn't quite explain what exactly is happening or what the implications are. Sometimes the same reaction is written like this, with another arrow pointing outward, indicating that a phosphate group is being donated. Visually, this may be easier to understand even if we don't know where that phosphate is going, but it is going somewhere. Also, sometimes we see ATP represented as balls and sticks models. We can see how an ATP molecule actually looks like. If we are familiar with these kinds of molecular models, we could easily recognize the base adenine, the sugar ribose, and where the three phosphate groups are. But that is if we are familiar with balls and stick models. An easier way to visualize the reaction we wrote before is by sketching the components of ATP before and after a phosphate has been donated. Here we just draw a rectangle to represent adenine, a pentagon to represent ribose, and then three circles representing the phosphate groups. This sketch tells us visually that there is a phosphate group that is terminal, and will make it easier to understand why ATP is considered an energetic molecule. Sketching ATP this way also helps us understand where is that energy that we all hear about and how ATP is able to provide it. The energy we talk about is contained in those bonds between the phosphate groups. When that bond is broken, energy is released. So when the terminal phosphate group is donated, when that bond is broken, energy is released and is used to power chemical reactions in the cell. Sometimes it's useful to think of ATP as a battery. As any battery, it can be fully charged or it can be empty after its charge has been used up. A fully charged battery is able to power reactions until its energy is replenished. It's like a cycle between the battery providing energy when it's charged and then requiring energy to be recharged. Using this analogy, we can think of ATP as the battery fully charged and ADP as the battery after it has donated energy and needs now to be replenished. ATP provides energy for cellular work, but once it becomes ADP, it needs to be replenished. A phosphate group needs to be added back to ADP so that it becomes again ATP. And then it will be able to donate the terminal phosphate once more. Like a battery, the molecule cycles between ATP and ADP, providing energy by donating a phosphate group and recharging by accepting a phosphate group. Donating a phosphate group is relatively easy. The bond holding the terminal phosphate is really easily broken. Replenishing the ATP molecule, on the other hand, is not that easy, and the reason is the electric charges of the phosphate groups. They are the same. Let's sketch this again. See the three phosphate groups in the circles? Each of these phosphates have the same negative charge. Like magnets with the same polarity, these groups really try to repel each other, but they are kept in place by their covalent bonds. That gives you an idea on how energetic those bonds are, and also illustrate how easy it is to break the bond to the terminal phosphate. To add a third phosphate group to ADP, that phosphate needs to be close enough to the other phosphates so that the bond is formed. You can imagine how difficult this is because the phosphate groups have the same electrical charge and they are trying to repel each other. Think of these when we revisit this process when we discuss how ATP is made at the end of the electron transport system. Adding phosphate to anything is what we call phosphorylation. So adding that third phosphate to ADP is indeed phosphorylation of ADP, and the purpose is to make ATP. The take-home message here is that ATP is important because it provides energy by donating the terminal phosphate group. It takes a lot of energy to phosphorylate ADP, because the phosphate groups have all the same electric charge. Since it takes so much energy to add that third phosphate group, then it makes sense that it's easier for the cell to use more ATP molecules that can donate one phosphate group instead of donating two consecutive phosphate groups. It would take an enormous amount of energy to replenish the ATP molecule that way. ATP is truly a commodity, and there is no organelle or structure to store it. And cells will make more than what they need, and they won't use more than what they need. And the most important fact to know about ATP is that no ATP means no life.